All right, and we're live. Hi, folks. Welcome to Stripe Developer Office Hours. My name is Cecil Phillip, and today's going to be a really interesting episode because we're going to be talking about MCP, Model Context Protocol. I'm having my friend Den, who's here from Microsoft, who's going to talk to us all about it. Now, Den, why don't you really quickly just give folks brief introductions to yourself, who you are, and what do you do?
Totally. Well, hello, hello. Thank you so much, Cecil, for having me here. I'm very excited to be on the show. We haven't talked in years. It's
It's
been
been
a
a long
while.
time.
It's
It
been a
has
long
been a
time.
long time.
Has been a long time. But I'm Dan. I work at Microsoft in our core AI division. So my responsibility is we're working on some of the AI incubations and AI infused or AI powered developer tools. And I'm also one of the core maintainers for MCP. So I work closely with the folks at Anthropic, with folks at AWS, and a bunch of other companies like Google to help shape the protocol because that's the new thing lately, right? And it's like we were saying, like MCP has existed for some time since last November.
It's funny because
Ages
the
in
the
AI era.
protocol it's funny, the protocol is not even a year old yet, but it feels like we've been talking about it for so long and everyone's really been diving into it. So it definitely feels a little bit older than it actually is, to be honest
It
with
got a lot of traction very, very quickly, shockingly so. And I think it speaks to the fact that the problems that it actually solves are problems that a lot of the folks in the community have.
you. Yeah, I agree with that. So what we're gonna do, so for folks that are new for developer office hours, um, generally what we do is just try and talk about all the fun things happening around the world and within the context of the Stripe ecosystem. And so what we're going to do is have a really fun conversation with Den. Feel free to drop your questions or anything of the sort in the chat. Let us know if you have any questions for us about model context protocol and use cases and patterns and things of that nature. We're going to try and get those answered live for you. But before we actually start diving into our conversation today, I'm just going to share my screen really quickly and let's kind of just go through some really quick housekeeping items super fast. So, obviously, we're talking about model context protocol, and just so happens that Stripe has an MCP server as well. And one of the things that you could do with it, as you can imagine, is invoke a lot of different operations against your Stripe account. So you can create products and customers and do all this types of fun stuff. And now we even have support for OAuth connections. So I know OAuth is hopefully one of the things that we'll be talking about in this conversation as we go on. But again, if you want to use, bearer tokens or OAuth or anything of the sort, using the Stripe MCP server, you can do that today. So definitely recommend that you head over to our docs at Stripe, docs.stripe.com/MCP, and you can learn all about it. Next thing I want to highlight really quick, our friends at Temporal built a really interesting tutorial that shows how to build durable AI agents, and this one actually shows you how to do it with, using a use case using Stripe. So definitely recommend you check this out. We're big fans of our friends at Temporal, so want to give them a quick shout out for putting together this really fun and interesting tutorial that's available on their documentation site. Um, Happening, I think, is this next week? I think this is next week, Thursday. We're going to be doing a live stream with our friends from Galileo AI. And we're going to be talking about, the Stripe Agent Toolkit. We're going to be talking about MCP servers and metrics and AI, all this fun stuff. As you can probably see the theme of what's happening here, there's a lot of AI stuff happening this month. So definitely feel free to come register and check this out. This is our over on Luma. You can go ahead and register for it here. Luma or Luma/Stripe-agents. And next thing I wanted to highlight for you folks is this video is playing. It should not be playing, so I'm sorry about that. But we actually did a live stream with our friends from Hypermode. So Hypermode is a really interesting service. It allows you to, you could, talk to your agents, I suppose. Like you could speak and build agents using natural language. They'll go ahead and run and host those agents for you, right? And so you can kind of put together really interesting applications. And we had a demo from Will last week who kind of showed us how some of that stuff works. So if you're interested in seeing, that entire conversation, we had that last week. Definitely go ahead and check out some of our past recordings here at the Stripe Developer YouTube channel. And last but not least, um, for folks that want to hang out with us in person, we are doing Stripe meetups all over the world. So if you head over to our meetups page, meetups.com/pro/stripe, you can see some of the locations that we'll be doing some events in. Our next two happen to be going down in London and Dublin. So this will be September 16th and 18th. But we also have meetups that we do in New York. There's Austin, Chicago, Toronto. Toronto is brand new. We haven't had this one yet, but this is hot off the presses. And tons of other locations as well. So if you want to hang out with us in person versus just hanging out with us here on YouTube or on the internet, definitely feel free to come and check out some of our Stripe meetups that we're hosting across our offices all over the world. Now, there we go. Right. Now we got that out of the way. So then let's get into it. Let's talk about MCP.
Man, I was gonna talk about a Stripe meetup, but you have nothing on the West Coast. Like, what the heck?
We're working on it. We're working on it. You know what it is? There's only so many people, and there's only so much time you can spend in an airplane before you've kind of had enough. So
no, I get it. Yeah, let's talk MCP. I'm fine. I'll be waiting for the West Coast meetup then.
It'll happen. And you know what? When it happens, I'll make sure I call you. I'm going to call you, email you, make sure that you're there so you know when it's going to happen. So first thing I wanted to ask you, so obviously everyone's talking about MCP. I wanted to kind of get your perspective. What's Dan's definition of what MCP is and like the value that it adds for folks trying to build like these agentic applications?
Yeah, so I'm gonna steal somebody else's explanation of this. And look, for me, in the distant era of AI, and this is we're talking about like months ago, think of like how people got excited about LLMs. Like the LLMs came into the picture and it was great and it's exciting. You just ask things and it will just do things for you. But what was the biggest problem? And what was the biggest problem when you talk to customers that especially are in the enterprise space, customers that are working around a lot of kind of the data that is more like locked in different silos, is they want LLMs to do something useful for them, but how do they do this? How do they connect those LLMs to that data? There's no centralized way of doing that. And people would come out with creative solutions like, oh yeah, I'll put this stuff in like a CSV file and then have the LLM parse the CSV file. Like it just okay, like this just doesn't scale. And it doesn't scale for a lot of other scenarios that people wanted to actually implement in their cases. So awesome folks at Anthropic, David Sarayapara, and a bunch of other folks have put together this thing called the Model Context Protocol. And the way they described it is basically a USB-C for LLMs, right? Like, you have a lot of these like disjoint data sources. You have databases, you have APIs, you have web services that carry some data behind the scenes. And the MCP layer essentially formalizes how that data can be exposed inside LLMs. And the explanation I was talking about that I'm going to steal from somebody else, and I heard it first from James Montemagno at Microsoft. We all know James, our good friend. And the way he put it is MCP, the way to actually understand it is to flip the acronym. It's a protocol for providing context to models. That's it. That's the magic of it, right? It's a protocol for providing context to models. And the way it does so, it essentially acts as that connective tissue behind the well, not behind, but like in between your actual data and the LLM, because it's standardized on a set of concepts like JSON RPC for the actual like interaction transfer between the client and the server, and then this way the server talks to the API is specifically the API, but we can get into more around that. But the core value prop is MCPs or MCP servers make your LLMs or the clients that are using LLMs actually useful for the context that you're operating with, because you can actually provide it that context in a way that the LLM can work consistently with. And it doesn't matter which vendor you're using, right? Like we know that MCP, Anthropic supports it, Microsoft supports it, we see OpenAI supporting it. There's all sorts of vendors that already snapped to the standard.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because when I think about way back in the day, as in last year, and I'm thinking about how, like, I had the question, like, how do I get my data into an LLM? Right. And then, a lot of us talk about APIs and databases and things of that nature, but like, there's more than just that, right? Like, there's other things that you want. Like you'd mentioned, I have documents in my OneDrive. I have, notes and physical documents, and I have all of these different types of information, right? Structured and unstructured information. I want to be able to plug my stuff in. And a lot of folks, I'm sure, built entire companies on like data ingestion, right? Like, how do I create like document intelligence, like all this types of stuff, and kind of bring it into like my training data and all this types of stuff. But still, at the end of the day, it was okay. I collected this data, but like, how do I collect it to this Injure framework that I'm working with, or this application that I'm building? And everyone had like a different way of doing it. And so now you're thinking about, okay, well, maybe this part of my company is using, I'm just gonna call out a framework, LangChain, and I'm
Hmm.
using, maybe I'm using like LangChain, the Python one, and then I have like the JavaScript one on the other side. I got to rewrite a connector, right? Because those are
Yep.
two different, completely different things. So when MCP came out, I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense. You know what I mean? Like I didn't really had to think about it too hard. And so as people started to adopt it, I'm like, this, it just kind of makes sense, right? Like this is
Right.
exactly what we needed. We need a way to like give context, right? And then in another word, like give data to these agents, these LLMs, like these, this intelligent software that we're trying to build, so you can know, okay, here's how I could give you a better answer
Yeah.
for the questions or the tasks that you're giving me to do.
Yeah, and it's magical to me because MCP at its core is not just a universal layer, but it actually allows you to completely not worry about how downstream APIs or tools operate. Right? If I, think about like within an organization, you might have different APIs. Somebody's using REST that returns JSON data, and you require OAuth to authorize yourself to the API. Somebody else has another API inside your company that maybe uses XML's return data, and then they require you to put an API token for some reason instead of actually using it, right? So you have all these like disjoint pieces that MCP just standardizes and like, no, no, no. The MCP server is going to take care of all this complexity that you're dealing with. It's going to take care of all the kind of the connectivity pieces that are required to connect the server to the client. And then the server is going to talk to whatever API downstream in whichever way the API requires. But the client never sees that. The client never has to worry about any of this. And we talk about MCP servers as connecting you to APIs, but they can do so much more, right? Because they expose a number of primitives. And we see things being built around MCP servers that are just amazing. Like one of my favorite MCP servers is the Playwright MCP server. So for
Mm.
folks that don't know Playwright, it's basically, think of it as the web testing orchestration framework that you can use to essentially solidify your web applications, your front end applications, to make sure that they're properly tested and have the right test coverage. But one of the magical things about it is that it can actually be used, the Playwright MCP server, to go and say, go explore this website and find out the areas that I need to go and test, right? I can just ask my LLM. It plugs in directly into Playwright. It plugs into the browser behind the scenes. It could be Chromium, it could be Edge, it could be Firefox. And then it just goes and does this, right?
Mm.
Like I'm not the one clicking around, like the AI is doing this. And to me, like this is magical. Blender MCP, like for folks that are dealing with, 3D modeling, like one of the amazing demos that if you haven't seen it, you should absolutely look up Blender MCP. It's just Google for it. It's available. And it just shows you how somebody from an LLM can define like a prompt for a scene and say, I want a scene with this like medieval castle with some dragons in it. And then it just goes and builds it because it knows the primitives to use within Blender, and the LLM just kind of controls it, and it looks at the output and makes a decision based on the output and goes and does further work, right? And it's all possible because the MCP server is the one that is actually that connective, like I said, connective tissue behind the client and the like whatever the downstream application is. To me, that's magical. Like, and there's so many of these scenarios that I see popping up that just make me think of, wow, our productivity is going to get such a boost. Like I can talk ages for like all of this stuff because I've seen things like reverse engineering MCP servers, like MCP servers that look at binary files and try to identify what they are. Is just the ecosystem really, really grew very, very fast, and people are coming up with super creative ways of leveraging it.
I'm kind of glad you went down that rabbit hole a little bit, because I've been looking at MCP as more than just like a tool for AI.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's interesting. When people talk about when we went to the moon,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the some of the interesting things that came out of that was like the technology that was built to get us there,
Yep.
right? And how that technology that came out of that initiative has kind of like affected everyone else's regular lives, right? And some of the other things that we have that we take for granted. I feel like our journey into AI, MCP is like one of those tools that we got out of it. And that even though we always so much so connected to I feel like there's going to be so much more that people are going to do with it.
Oh yeah.
Um, like I was thinking
100%.
the other day, if I can just add tools and now like my UI just kind of lights up with like additional functionality,
Hmm.
Like I can imagine how that could completely change the way that we just build software in general, whether it's AI related or not, right? I can imagine that we have like these blank shells, right? Like these
Hmm.
blank shell UIs. And I'm just like, oh, I feel like doing this task today. And instead of me having like Office or Excel or whatever, I just compose MCP servers together. And it just kind of like turns the UI to whatever I want it to be because this is the task I want to do today. um, I totally see like stuff like that could be 100% possible, right?
Yes.
Because now if every service offers again tools and things of that nature, and we could talk to the software, then I see no reason why that's not a future that we could start working toward.
Totally. And what you actually alluded to just now is that composability of MCP servers is critical to the ecosystem because when we talk about MCP servers, it's not that I'm using one at a time, right? It's not that I'm like, oh, I'm using the Playwright MCP server. Like, let me plug it in and turn it on, and now let it do things. Like, no, you're actually operating in the context of the MCP client that has an LLM accessible. So you could be working in Claude Desktop, you could be working in Claude Code, Visual Studio Code, you could be working in Visual Studio, right? Like all these tools, and you connect multiple servers. And we see this composability play out today. Like things that we're working on, things that we're exploring, and we see other folks in the industry look at things like spec driven development, for example, right? Like, well,
Yeah.
we define specs, and then based on those specs, the AI is going to go and build the application. But development, we know for a fact that it's not just about writing specs and writing code. Like, you have to go and run tests and go and try deploying things and seeing how they work, and then go and open GitHub issues for task tracking, right? And this is where the MCP server ecosystem shines because you start composing these things together where it's like, okay, I'm building my applications. I need Playwright MCP for testing the application and figuring out what the test should be. And I'm going to do this to run those tests. I'm going to use the GitHub MCP to go and open issues for me for every task that I'm opening. And then it's going to open pull requests when I'm ready. Then I'm going to use the Figma MCP to bring in some design that my designers have put
Yeah.
together for this and transform the design into an actual page format, right? So you start seeing this composability play out today. Like, it's not fiction. Like, this exists and people are leveraging it because the superpower they afford is exactly what you just said, is that interoperability between different components that just work. And I, as a developer, I don't need to figure out what the Figma API is, whether they have a CLI for this that I need to plug in. Like, oh, what about GitHub? Like, how does GitHub does auth? I don't care. I plug in the MCP server, I auth with it once, I'm on my way. That's it. That's kind of it. And it's going to be especially critical the more we move to kind of the agentic world where we know for a
Yeah.
fact that there's no human in the loop, right? And the agents need to make those decisions independently. Like, oh, I need to get a design. Where do I get a design from? I'm going to go to Figma. How do you train the agent to go to Figma? Well, with an MCP server, because the MCP server exposes that layer to Figma without the agent having to write like an API layer to go and talk to Figma.
And you know what the powerful thing about that to me is not just the composability, but it's like universal composability,
Yes.
right? So I could write these servers in whatever language and host them in whatever operating system, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, as long as I'm exposing the protocol, right? Like I could essentially like tie everything together. So it's
Right.
almost I can even see it as like a universal plugin architecture, right? Like I can plug in compositions of functions and resources and things of that nature from anywhere and kind of again make my application whatever I want it to be as
Mm-hmm.
long as I'm able to like speak over the wire, using this protocol that's
Right.
already well defined.
Right. And there's two types of MCP servers, right? Like, you can create. You can create remote MCP servers, which basically are hosted somewhere. You have the HTTP transport, and then
Mhm.
you connect them by URL. You plug in a URL and say, here's my GitHub MCP server. Go talk to this MCP server to get the list of tools and prompts and everything else that it has supported. Or I can run it locally because there's also local MCP servers. They use the STDIO transport, the standard input output. And in this case, I can just run something right on my box inside a Docker container, or with NPX, or with Python, or .NET. Like, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And there's that flexibility, right? Where you as a developer, you as a consumer of these MCP servers, are not really constrained to one particular workload, one particular kind of modality in which it's exposed. You can, depending on the scenario, like Blender MCP runs locally. I don't need a remote server for that, right? It's something that's on my box that's controlling my
Yeah.
instance of Blender. If I have a GitHub MCP server, well, it can be remote because it controls my remote GitHub instances and content in my repository. So there's a lot of this flexibility that's well thought out and baked in right from the get go.
A lot of folks compare MCP, like the protocol, to Open API, right? They're
Mm,
like, hey, we're exposing like this functionality, and then people are able to access it, however they want. And I don't, I don't disagree, but I think a better analogy for me has always been like LSP, right? The language
yes.
server protocol, right?
Yes.
And so folks that know LSP, if you have VS Code or an editor or whatever the case is, right? Like this is how you can have like these editors, I guess, this shell of an editor, and then just kind of light up functionality based on whatever different language that you're running in. I
Hmm.
think MCP for me is more akin to that, right? Because now, again, like I can light up my application with some of these different, again, these different servers and these different bits and of functionality. I think one of the things that's interesting to me, and I'm kind of curious to see how operating system makers kind of deploy this, is I'd love to see if operating systems are just going to come with like built-in MCP servers and agents out of the box, like built into the OS. So now, seeing better performance, better integration for like some of those local testing things, right? Being able to access file systems and work with, local network devices, I think would be interesting. Because I
Yeah.
think about like, for instance, I have like a little home network thing going on with like some smart devices and things of that nature. And I know a lot of them expose APIs, right? Like they're just regular HTTP APIs, but they're running local hosts, right? So whenever I connect to them, I'm not going into outer space and coming back to my house to turn off the light switch, right? So I can imagine things like that happening for folks that are building MCP, right? So again, another use case is me just running that locally in my house and having an intelligent conversation with this MCP server or this agent about like how I want to, I don't know, turn on the alarm or you know start the car or whatever the case is, right? Like whatever my
Yeah.
local needs happen to be.
Yeah, and this is something that's actually like you actually alluded to LSP, and this is like if you look through the design of MCP as a whole, you will see like echoes of LSP for sure. Like I think it got heavily influenced by that. And all of this stuff, by the way, is in the specification, so you can go to the spec site. I posted the link in our studio chat that folks can uh, later get it from from after our live stream. But you can look at the specification, you can look at all the components that exist within MCP, and you'll notice that like a lot of this sounds like very LSP-ish. And that is intentional because again, like if we compare this to OpenAI, or sorry, Open API. There's too many open things, and we look at the Open API structure. Like it makes a lot of assumptions for how APIs should be structured, how APIs should be laid out, like how the kind of the REST format. It has to have all these kind of specific concepts baked in, like authentication, authorization. But the thing is, when you start breaking that out into other API scenarios, they quickly run into cases where, well, my API is not really Open API compliant. Doesn't mean that my LLM can't use it. Doesn't mean that I need to now bake another thing that's on top of it that is going to be just for that API. Like it adds a bit of a hassle. And one could argue that's like, well, aren't you doing
Yeah.
the same with MCP? You have to build this thing on top of it anyway. But the thing is, MCP is very opinionated about how LLMs consume it at all layers of the stack. Like whether you're looking remote, whether it's local, whether it's an XML API, whether it's a REST API, it's all the same. Like you're not necessarily trying to shoehorn things in a way that is just like Open API specific, right? And especially for local scenarios that we talked about, it's not just about talking to APIs. It's not just about talking to some remote resource
Yeah.
somewhere. What about controlling my local applications? But you alluded to something very important, and that is going to be also a good thing in my view about MCP is that it makes no opinion about vendor, no opinion about the client, no opinion about the company that's running it. It's a protocol. It's basically like it's a pipe for your data. And that pipe can run with, let's say, the world where you described a scenario, you have a local network, maybe you're running a local LLM. Maybe you're running something like Olama, or maybe a bunch of other kind of models connected like QN or anything like that, and you're running it on your box. Like you don't want this data, you don't want the egress to happen from your house to some other destinations. Well, guess what? Like MCP can still work for those because you can still connect to it. And as long as your LLMs, your models know how to do things like tool calling with the help of your client, you're good. Like that's the magic of MCP. It just works. It's a standard that kind of spans all these vendor boundaries. Like you're not constrained to just one particular client. Nobody's convincing you that you need to install VS Code to be using MCP. You can use a
Right.
bunch of other providers, a bunch of other vendors.
So I want to dive into the weeds a little bit about
Yeah.
like the protocol itself. Now, from my understanding, like so there's three core primitives, right, that we have inside of this protocol, right? Like so there's tools, there's resources, and there's prompts. So I know a lot of folks, I'm assuming, are familiar with tools, right? Like I have a function or an operation and I want you to like run this thing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that might be an API, that might be whatever the case is, right? I'm kind of curious about the other two because I don't hear a
Yeah.
lot of folks talk about those ones. Like, what are some use cases you've seen in your experience with folks, exposing resources and prompts via MCP servers?
Yeah. So here's kind of the delineation. And by the way, I also will link you to a blog post from Ina Harper. She just published it just the other day, and it talks about specifically prompts because prompts is one of those like it's an underappreciated underappreciated capability. But the difference is the core kind of delta between tools and prompts is that tools are generally invoked by the LLM itself, or the client is passing to the LLM because you need to call in a I get data from my database, insert record, run playwright, and open a URL. Prompts are more user controlled. So I can have some templates for things that my server might be able to do. Like I want to create a new application, a new web app with a specific framework, right? And my server might have some templates inside of it that says like, oh, I know what to do if you ask me to create an app for Next.js, if you ask me to create an app for Vue, or anything like that. So prompts bake in a lot of this kind of context into user invoked capabilities that I can go into my
Hmm.
LM with a slash command and say, create web app. And then I say, like, my web app is this with this framework. And then the server will be able to parse it out and react to it. The resources thing is interesting because the resources, it's essentially an addressable space for lack of a better word, resources like databases, files. Maybe behind the scenes, my server should be able to connect to some third-party API, but I don't want to expose that API surface directly to the LLM. Like, for example, if I query my um, bank account or something like that through my LLM, how do I like I could of course build a tool for it, or I could just say a resource where because the bank can do a lot of things. It can do things like transfer money, require like query balance. I can essentially implement a quasi like REST API addressable space for my
Right.
resources that I can do like templatize and say, bank slash template user slash query balance, right? And then the LLM knows how to invoke those resources, and those resources, by the way, can also be used from prompts, which is
Hmm.
great because then I can kind of have this reuse and connectivity. Again, look at Ina Harper's blog post; it explains it much better than I do. But
Gotcha.
it grows on this kind of the stack of it's not just about the LLM invoking and doing something, but also about getting data, pulling data, and having the user specifically trigger data actions. And this is where the prompts are very, very helpful. I will call out there's three other things that are also being missed. Like we talked about the
Hmm.
primitives like the prompts, resources, and tools, and these are server primitives. There's
Right.
also client primitives, and
Hmm.
these are roots, sampling, and elicitations. So
Hmm.
very, very important to call out. So, and this is because not a lot of people know about roots. And roots are effectively boundaries that you establish for your MCP server to operate in. So, for example, you can, if your client operates in a workspace like VS Code, where you have your code base, your project open, roots establish the boundary for where the server can actually look to get data. So, if I go and
Huh.
say, oh, I want to, re-architect the code base, and the MCP server knows that I'm operating just within the context of this root, which is in this case my workspace, my code base, my file system, right?
Sure.
Very, very cool. And we know VS Code supports it. Shameless plug, VS Code, shout out.
And that's
The other
interesting
one
because I've
is
never heard about that before. I'll be
yeah,
very
well,
honest with
it's nobody did. It's like we were at MCP Developer Summit in San Francisco, and we were talking to Solomon Hikes from Dagger, And he was actually brought up the concept, was like, oh, I'd love to use roots. And we're like, oh, yes, like you're the first person that asked us for it. So not a lot of people know, but it's an awesome capability that exists in MCP servers.
Got it.
Sampling allows the MCP servers to actually invoke capabilities within your LLMs before it returns the data. So, for example, if my server does some operation, I can say, but I want that data returned in Markdown format. The server can ask the local LLM that's actually, or whatever LLM your client is using, say,
Sure.
like, before you return it to the server, can you transform this into Markdown format and then send it back, right? So you have this kind of reverse invocation almost happening. And then elicitation, which is, it actually launched recently with the June 18th spec revision. But elicitations allows servers to request structured input from clients. And this is basically when your servers, like, let's say we talk about the server that bootstraps my applications. And I have an MCP server that comes in and says, before you bootstrap something, I want to know which specific framework do you want to use? And this is where the server basically sends to the client a message that says, how about you prompt the user to actually tell me what is the framework they want to use? And the client can do this in many ways, depending on what the server defined. It could be an enum, where I can say, I only want to allow Next.js, Vue, or some other framework like
Sure.
Byte. Or I can ask for a specific number, like how many projects do you want to bootstrap? Like there's this schema binding that allows me to not necessarily rely on the LLM guessing from my prompt. It's like, oh, I want to bootstrap Next.js. Don't parse that out. Just ask the user directly for what do you want. And this is a recent capability that is, again, already lighting up in a lot of the clients. But these are the things I want to make sure that folks are also aware of.
Yeah, I think those last two in particular were very interesting. I recently learned about those, and like when I think about the elicitation one, right? It's it's almost like it's like the server's asking you, like I'm querying, I'm like reverse. It's like a reverse query, I suppose,
Yeah.
right? Like you're asking me for something, and I'm asking for clarification,
Yeah,
right? Like,
and schematized clarification, because I know for a fact that what the client is going to give back is going to match my schema. If I say, like, go and analyze my blog for SEO issues, and then the server can say, can you give me the URL for your blog? But I want to make sure that you actually submit a URL. Like, don't submit me some random text of like a blog post. Like, I want you to send me a URL. And this is where that schema enforcement comes in, where the client can say, I can only accept a URL for this. And the client does the validation and everything before they send it to the server. Uh, but it enables for that structured input to actually flow from the client to the server.
but I'm guessing you can do a similar thing with sampling as well, right? Because sampling is almost like, hey, I'm gonna go back and ask you to run this thing for me, right? On
Right.
your LLM of choice. But then I'm assuming I'm gonna want that back in a format that I'm expecting to process it, no?
Yeah, there's several ways to go about it, of course, but like you're relying on more like non-deterministic input, if you will. Like it's like
Sure.
you're relying on the fact that, like, whatever the LM is going to produce, hopefully it matches what I want. But here I say, like, I want you explicitly submit this data and nothing else, and that makes it just a little bit easier and more predictable. But again, there's several ways to go about this for sure.
Got it. One thing I wanted to make sure I asked you about. So on the perspective of tooling, how do I update like my tool registrations? Like, is there any type of like dynamic tool discovery mechanism? Like, hey, I have the Stripe MCP server hypothetically.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we actually have one, but hypothetically, we're talking about this one, and we push an update that adds a bunch more tools. Like, how does the clients get notified by that? Like, would one of these things that you mentioned, like elicitation, for example, or sampling, be like, hey, I'm going to send you an update to let you know that there's more stuff, or is there like other mechanisms built into the platform for that?
There's mechanisms for notifications and progress reports, but they're baked into some of the primitives. They're not necessarily about dynamic discovery. I think there's
Gotcha.
actually a spec enhancement proposal or a SEP that is specifically addressing dynamic tool discovery, because, like, I'm connected to a server is
Sure.
running, and then some tools change. Like, how do you manage that? Because right now, for a lot of the flows that we have, it relies on that initialization flow. Like, I start my client, I connect to the MCP server, it does
Yeah.
the initialize call, and then it says, like, oh, I have these tools or these descriptions. But then you're running into that problem of, okay, but like tools change and like new tools get added, tools get removed. How do you update it? And I think that is a bit TBD right now. But I'd say the latest always refer to the specification site. That is where a lot of this content is going to be captured.
So you had mentioned earlier that you're a part of the the working group that works on the MCP protocol. Tell me a little bit about like what is that process like? So can you just mention like we should definitely check in here for updates, but I'm guessing people could submit revisions.
Mhm.
I'm guessing there's a GitHub repo. Like how do people get involved like you did?
Yes. Yes. So, first of all this is open source. Like literally all of the model context protocol. So I'm gonna link you to our GitHub, and we can just use that as a starting point. Everything there is open, available to everyone. You can read through. You can look at the work items that are on deck. Like none of the planning, none of the future work is in any way, shape, or form secret. Right. Like one of the things that recently got announced is some changes to the governance structure of how the MCP project is actually handled. And
Okay.
that governance structure is essentially that there is a group of lead maintainers. These are the founders of the protocol. There are some core maintainers. There is also maintainers for specific groups. They're working groups like the OOTH working group. And these are the awesome folks like Aaron Parecki that are working on OOTH and making sure that they're fleshing out kind of the story there. And also, with this governance process change, one of the things that got introduced is because before, like if you wanted to add a change, if you wanted to suggest a modification to the protocol, you'd have to kind of navigate this bit of a maze of like, well, like, do I ask people? Do I write a Google Doc for this? And do I pitch it to someone before they get approval? Now it's all standardized on what I refer to as like the spec enhancement proposal. Anybody can go to GitHub, anybody can open an issue and follow the SEP guidelines. And the SEP guidelines are also available. Let's link to them as well. Anybody can submit it. And what happens then is that the maintainer community or the core maintainers or the lead maintainers are meeting fairly regularly to go and review what's on deck. They look at the list of like, okay, people are proposing these things, and these things are actually seem like they're important. Let's go and analyze them and see if this is something that we want to embed into the protocol, because there's a lot of proposals, of course. Like not every single one of them is going to make it through, and that's okay. But there's a lot of community driven work that has been feeding into the protocol that again comes from outside. Like it's not just folks at Anthropic coming up with these things. The prime example that comes to my mind is selfishly because this is the project that I was involved in, was when we rewrote the authorization specification. And for that, we worked with just a massive group from the community. Like people were from old companies, like we worked with AWS, Microsoft, Google, Okta, and we just all came together to put this new spec change, and we worked with the folks at Anthropic to get it through, and now it's live. It's the latest version, right? So it's very community driven, very community oriented. For contributors, there's an open Discord that you can join today. Again, like you can look at the blog post that we're also going to link to, which is our governance announcement. But you can join the Discord if you're a contributor. Keep in mind, this is not for MCP support. Don't go there saying like my MCP server can connect. Like, what do I do? Like, it's not
My
for that. It's
MCP
for
is broken.
contributors.
Please fix it, kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. It's not for that, unfortunately. But if you're a contributor or you're somebody interested in contributing, that is a good starting point, because you'll see a lot of these kind of async conversations happening, folks discussing their proposals, folks talking about like the gaps in the protocol that they wish to be addressed. And of course, the GitHub repository that we linked to earlier, which is the kind of the source of truth for everything that's on deck right now. And again, open to anybody. We're very welcoming of newcomers. You can look at the issues, you can engage in conversation, you can look at the review PRs, like all the stuff is done entirely in the open.
Nice. And so, like you mentioned, one of the enhancements that kind of went through this process was the OAuth,
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
authorization enhancements that were added, right? And so, I guess that kind of goes right into a question I had for you, which was, so if I'm building an MCP server, I'm building a remote MCP server. This
Mm-hmm.
is out on the public internet. Um, Today, I'm guessing that we can use OAuth, but do you have any other, I don't know, maybe you want to talk about that a little bit and like some of the ways that you recommend that folks handle security when it comes to MCP
Absolutely.
servers?
They should absolutely use OAuth. And the beautiful thing about a lot of these things is that when we talk about the specification, like, oh, we updated the specification, that sounds a little scary. It's like, well, do I need to write or go and read 15 pages of the spec to understand how to build? It's like, no, you don't. You can use the SDKs. We have SDKs that do this for you. The C# SDK supports auth. Like you can look at the TypeScript SDK. There's all this goodness that's already baked into a lot of the tools that are official MCP tools. And so you
Yeah.
should absolutely use the SDKs to build OAuth capabilities within your server. The primary thing that we actually did with the recent spec change is we split the responsibility of what's known as the resource server and the authorization server. The resource server is basically your API server, it's the
Sure.
MCP server, and the authorization server is the server that's responsible for minting tokens. And we do not want people to go and mint their own tokens. We want you to use off the shelf authorization servers. Like if you're using whether it's Okta or Entra or Auth0, Keycloak, doesn't matter, but use off the shelf providers. So if you're building a secure, protected remote MCP server, OAuth should be your default starting point. Now, of course, the specification outlines kind of the minimum bar. Like your servers should support OAuth if they're protected and you expect clients to connect to them in a universal way, right? If I build with OAuth and I plug it into Claude Desktop, things will work. If I build with OAuth and I plug it into VS Code, things will work. That doesn't stop you from, example, building internal MCP servers within your company. They use certificate auth. If you want to use certificate auth for, then you just need clients that actually support certificate auth. So you can absolutely do this. Or maybe you have servers that talk to other servers and they authorize themselves to other entities with certificates, and that's totally fine. But you'll have to kind of figure that out by yourself. But in addition to auth, though, OAuth is just the part of the puzzle here because you have to set up this authorization layer. But then there's
Yeah.
the other piece, which is there's still some security best practices that you should absolutely follow. And we have a document for that as well. Surprise, surprise. It literally is called Security
Surprise,
Best
surprise.
Practices. And the Security Best Practices document is designed to outline some of the learnings that we have from building servers with OAuth. And it describes on the attack surfaces, it describes on the mitigations, and it talks about how you, as somebody that built a production ready MCP server, can take these learnings and bake them in and not repeat the mistakes that people did early on as they kind of started building out a lot of these server capabilities. Because we see a lot of confusion happening, for example, for things like token pass through, which actually probably was one of the most important things that people do, is because they think like, well, I want to build an MCP server for Stripe, right? I am Dan. I don't work at Stripe. I'm not responsible for the Stripe API, but I want to build an MCP server for Stripe. So I'm going to use OAuth and I'm going to use the Stripe login to go and build this out and say, like, you can log in with Stripe to get access to my server. You should not be doing that because, again, you're not going to get an authorization or access token or Stripe for that server because Stripe itself is going to authorize it for the Stripe API. So the anti-pattern here should always avoid is like this token pass-through. You acquire a token for some other service like Stripe, Gmail, Salesforce, and then pass it to your server and say, go do something with this Stripe token. That is bad, bad, bad. There's a lot of bad things that will happen from that. Do not do that. But all this is documented in the security best practices because there's a lot of things you should really, really consider if you're building a production-ready MCP server.
So, question then. So when I think about OAuth, and maybe other folks that are watching, you might have this similar perspective too. I always think about OAuth as in giving permissions on behalf of a user to go carry on some action on their behalf, right? So my calendar or my email or things that are specific to me. But if I want to carry off an operation and I want to secure the operation, but it's not specific to me. It's not tied to me as an individual. Do you think I should still go down that OAuth path? Or because I know a lot of folks use like API keys and all these types of things, but it's just a very generic call that I just want you to make? Or do you think they should still really consider like building their auth story around OAuth? What is your thought around those
Yeah.
types of scenarios?
It really depends on kind of the purpose and the design of your server. So in a lot of the OAuth piece that we describe, you have some entity, in this case, the user, that needs to
Mhm.
authorize themselves to be able to access the MCP server. That says
Mhm.
nothing about what the MCP server does downstream on whose behalf it operates downstream. It can be like baked in with API keys and secrets, although don't do that. But the actor, the person that essentially is the one that engages with the MCP server that provides the credentials to access that MCP server is the one that is mainly the responsible party here. So it doesn't need to be a person, for the record. Like you can have
Okay.
another server talking to another server. You can use like actual
Sure.
like confidential clients, if you will, like what we refer to, and use client credentials of some kind. And there's actually a
Mhm.
specification enhancement proposal to bake that into the spec for client credentials, but like you could use those as well. So you can be an agent that operates on the MCP server. So it's not always about the human in the loop. Like there's definitely
Got
ways
it.
in which you can structure this to make sure that there's autonomous scenarios that exist. Now, I also will mention that there are efforts to standardize this. So, for example, again, selfishly plugging in Enter ID from Microsoft, there is discussions around agentic identity, and this is where
Mm.
you have agents that are operating on behalf of the user with specific set of scopes, specific set of limitations that are plugging into a lot of the stuff. But again, because it's built on top of the OAuth foundation, a
Right.
lot of the stuff will just work, right?
So when you talk about the agentic identity, like the first thing I think about is service principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like so for folks way back when we used to work on Windows Server 2000 and 2002 stuff like that. We used to just create these service principles, like these users that just represent your application or the
Right.
identity of your application, and you apply Active Directory or LDAP to that user
Mm-hmm.
and give them access or deny them access to certain resources, right? So I'm guessing when you think about or when you talk about agentic identity, I'm assuming it's something along those lines that there's some generic virtual identity, I suppose. Like it's not a real person, obviously, but there's
Right.
just like a registration for a thing, right? And then now I can apply policies to that thing.
Right, but it's also much more dynamic because service principles are very like rigid, right? Like you have a service
Okay.
principal that has access to a database. Great. Now you can use that service principal to go to your service to talk to the database. But there's a problem with that is that because that service principal, like it just lives on. It has
Mm-hmm.
these like hard-coded permissions. With a lot of the agentic identity, the crux of the issue here is like I want to spin up an agent that's going to go in and schedule a meeting with Cecil,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I want that agent. I needed to log in with my like. Well, I will be the one that logs in with my credentials to some system somewhere, and then I want to delegate this agent to go things on my behalf.
Mm-hmm.
But I also only want to have that agent be able to access my calendar and nothing else, right? So I need to
Gotcha.
subscope it from kind of the giant set of permissions that I then have to go and say this agent can only access the calendar and nothing else, right?
Gotcha.
So there's that part here. The other thing here is if I send the agent and the agent goes and schedules an invite with the CEO of Stripe instead of Cecil. Well, okay, somebody screwed up. You need that trail that actually looks and says, well, who spun up the agent? Who's responsible for this agent? Oh, it's Den. Den sent the agent, right? And this is because, like, you in a service principal, you don't have the traceability. It's like service principal went and did something. Here, I need to know this was an identity that acted on my behalf, and through the entire chain of operations that it did, I want to be able to look and say, through every step of the way, I know on behalf of whom it's acting that I can actually trace this accountability line across. So very, very important. And the other pieces here is that a lot of these agents, they can be either persistent or they can be dynamic. It could be a persistent where I have an agent like a scheduler agent, right, that runs on my behalf all the time.
Sure.
So when you ping my email, this agent just picks up the invites and goes and schedules whatever else. But there might be an agent that's very temporal, where I say this is an agent that is supposed to test this application, go run this. It spins up the identity, it tests the application, and then just disappears. It vanishes. It's gone. So I need to have that flexibility that today does not exist with service principles. And for a lot of these things, these are the explorations that are happening around agentic identity is these scoping issues, the issues around the life cycle, the issues around accountability and observability and traceability that are all kind of going to be baked in.
Nice. So, Dan, I think we're getting close down on time. What I want to do is give you a couple of minutes. Maybe you could talk to us about, some of the ways that folks could, just get involved. Where are some of the places that you're going to be?
Yep,
How can we continue this conversation, continue this story as we go on, like learning more and the
totally.
spec keeps evolving.
I love this. This is my favorite question from this entire show.
Dum dum
Um,
dum dum.
so I think for Model Context Protocol, your starting point should always be modelcontextprotocol.io. This is the official website for all things MCP. You can have our documentation, the spec, community guidelines. You can discover our Discord. You can have our blog. Everything is right there, right? So like, but Cecil has it on the screen. Please go to modelcontextprotocol.io. This is your starting point. And we're evolving it constantly. Like we're writing a lot of more documentation and samples and all the SDK coverage is there. The other thing I would highly recommend you explore is the Model Context Protocol repository. It's very easy to remember. It's github.com/model context protocol/model context protocol. And that repository has all the specification pieces, all the documentation. You can look at existing issues. And one of the things that, by the way, we've baked in from the very beginning is that there's the following standard GitHub conventions. You can look at things tagged as good first issue. If you want to
Oh,
contribute,
nice.
I would highly encourage you to go there and contribute, right? And the same, like Cecil is looking at the C# SDK, like there's plenty of work to be done in the SDK. We want you to test it. We want you to help us grow it. We want you to help us document it. There's a lot of work ahead and a lot of excitement and a lot of openness in the community for contribution and collaboration. I think that's what I really, really love about MCP is that how collaborative this entire project feels and that there's no isolated silos where people are working together. Like we're all here to build a better protocol. So I would encourage you to check that out. Outside of that, I'm going to be tomorrow at VS Live speaking about MCP. So
Oh,
it's going to
nice.
be on Microsoft Campus. It's going to be available on live stream on YouTube. I don't have a link handy for you, but if you search VS Live Redmond 2025, I'm sure you'll find it on YouTube. Go there. And I'm going to be at GitHub Universe later this year in October talking about MCP security as well. So if you're at GitHub Universe in San Francisco, let me know and we'll catch up then.
Awesome. So it sounds like you're going to be all over the place talking about
All over the
MCP.
place.
So there's no lack of information to learn about MCP,
No,
to engage with folks virtually and in person. I think you mentioned there's a Discord channel too. So if folks want to
yeah.
jump in and have conversations about like evolving the protocol, like they could also do that too.
Highly encourage you to contribute because again, there's a lot of work ahead. There's very like we're not very tolerant of gatekeeping. Like anybody can come in, everybody's welcome, contribute, help us. Any contribution counts, however small. Like if you want to fix a typo in a documentation, great. Like we love the contribution too. If you want to go and create a whole new spec proposal, great. Do that too. All contributions are
Nice.
welcome.
All contributions are welcome. Well, awesome. Well, folks, thank you all so much for watching us. We just learned all about like MCP, model context protocol from Den. Hopefully, we'll have him come back on again soon, and we can kind of dive into it some more and maybe see some demos and maybe we can even see how the Entra ID stuff works with MCP. Like that would be great. We could have that conversation
That'd be
too.
great.
But again, thank you all for watching, and this has been another episode of the Stripe Developer Office Hours. We will see you again next week. I think next week we're going to have either Docker or actually I should just go check. Why don't we head over to the dum 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 dum? I want to share my screen again because I should know this off the top of my head. Um, if you head over to, let's do this next week. If you come over here and we hit this live button, we will be speaking to we're going to be speaking to Yaron. We're going to be talking about building robust agentic systems with Dapper agents. So that's what we're going to be doing next week. And then after that, I think we'll have the Docker folks that's going to be talking about the Docker model runner, the Docker MCP catalog, all those types of fun stuff. So again, like I mentioned, all things AI, all things MCP, all things agents this month on the Stripe Developer YouTube channel. So please, like and subscribe, just like James always loves to say. And we will
Like and
see you all
subscribe.
next time.
See you,
All right.
folks.
See you, folks.